All right, today we're going to be looking at a new phenomenon, switching gears a little bit from the Middle East back to Europe, and looking at the period of détente, specifically the 20 years following the Cuban Missile Crisis, and about halfway through Ronald Reagan's presidency. Um, and in general, what you want to know is the word détente means simply a relaxing of tensions. All right, a lessening of tensions is a French word. All right, but we are going to apply it to the tensions between communist-led Soviet Union and the U.S.-led Western nations. Okay, but there's a lot going on here. This is the period where we have the Vietnam War. It's the period also in Europe and the United States where there were mass demonstrations for more democracy and less government control in 1968. So we see a lot of phenomenons kind of being grouped into this 20-year, two-decade period. Western European nations will become less dependent on the U.S. during this time period, and Eastern Europe will also push to gain more autonomy away from the Soviet Union. By the late 70s and 80s, though, especially with the election of Ronald Reagan, we see a new era of tensions and the labeling of the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Quickly, though, within a decade after Reagan comes into his presidency, the Soviet Union will collapse. Now, in terms of weapons, okay, part of the first, ways that we release tensions is to get rid of weapons. So in 1963, the world's major economic powers meet, signed two treaties, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Test Ban Treaty just simply said that no atomic weapons should be tested in the atmosphere or in space or even underwater, like we see with the Bikini Atoll testings. And I'll pull up a picture of that. This was the United States testing of a hydrogen bomb in the South Pacific. Put a bunch of ships out there, all right, just to see what would happen. Pretty impressive pictures. You can view this online. You can see all sorts of video footage from this testing as well. But we decided no longer going to do that anymore. That you could test underground, but not above ground. China and France do not sign that, mainly because they are very, very close or have just tested a nuclear bomb. Also, the next treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 98 nations signed this, but also many do not. Proliferation just simply means to spread, so a non-proliferation treaty would prevent the spreading of atomic weapons to new nations. China and France, right, non-signers of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, they don't sign this as well. Also, Israel, India, and Pakistan do not sign it, and they are, once again, developing nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan generally hate each other, and Israel, of course, is trying to become a major world power, even though they're a teeny tiny country. So they do not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that's why today they have atomic weapons. We also see the Soviets and the U.S. create a direct hotline, Hotline Bling, I'm talking about, Drake. Because, remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy could not talk to each other. They didn't have a direct phone line to each other's offices. They actually had to communicate through spies. And it was amazing that we were able to even have that conversation at all to know what the other side was thinking. So as a result, to prevent any sort of miscommunication or assumptions that could lead to nuclear war and the deaths of millions of people, we basically create a phone line that can make the Soviets and the U.S. communicate with each other. The U.S. sells large amounts of wheat to the Soviets to help them through famines. Tourism is encouraged on both sides. The best ballet in the world, the Bolshoi Ballet, visits the U.S., and even Louis Armstrong performs in East Berlin, which, even though it's not in the Soviet Union, is behind the Iron Curtain. Europe at this time creates a common market, which is the precursor to the European Union. Tariffs go down, and West Germany emerges as an enormously powerful economic center in Europe, and still kind of is today, although it's not just West Germany, it's all Germany. And the U.S., rightly so, fears they cannot compete with this new strong European power. It's especially damning given that Americans will stop buying American-made goods and will actually buy cars, television sets, and other products from Europe, specifically appliances, because they're so well made, and even with tariffs are cheaper. The U.S. currency is devalued during this time period. And basically, this is reflective of the fall of the U.S. as the world's #1 economic power. Or sorry, not the fall of it, the downturn of it. It still is the world's #1 economic power. But Americans are no longer just going to buy American-made goods. They'll buy BMWs, right? They'll buy other appliances that are made over in Europe. In France, we have a new leader in 1958, a guy by the name of Charles de Gaulle. Gotta love his double fist pump. He stabilizes the French government that had 27 different governments in 2 years. I know that's hard to imagine, in the last 13 years we've seen. Sorry, I should say 13 years. My fault. The last 13 years we've only seen 3 governments, right? So the idea of 27 governments or 2 per year is pretty incredible. And we think there's a quick turnaround in the United States. But France in the post-war era was something else entirely. He's a big-time nationalist. He wants to end the Algerian War, which has been draining the French economy for years at this point. They test a nuclear bomb in 1964. De Gaulle pulls out French forces from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that had held basically all of the Western democracies in a military alliance. And really, de Gaulle is trying to create a unique path for France. He sees France as a third force between the Soviet Union and the U.S. that isn't truly capitalist or truly communist, but is just itself, right? This was actually similar to what Nasser was trying to do in Egypt. It's pretty effective. De Gaulle stays in power for a decade, but in 1968, Parisian students from the University of Paris started a wave of protests against de Gaulle. They're leftist. De Gaulle is more conservative. Workers go on strike as well, and though de Gaulle restores order, he loses his prestige and has to resign a year later in 1969. Also, during this time period, we see a massive transition in power in the Soviet Union. In 1964, Khrushchev is ousted from power, and we have a new leader, Leonid Brezhnev. All right, there's him right there. He was known for wearing all sorts of awards on his chest. But anyway, Khrushchev is more or less placed under house arrest until 1971 when he dies. The reasons he's removed is for poor harvests, which you could say are not necessarily his fault, but the collective farm and the way to deal with these sorts of food catastrophes, he's not seen as dealing with them effectively. The Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, he was the one that backed down first and had to remove missiles from Cuba. He was seen as being more authoritarian. His de-Stalinization campaigns were getting less popular. And he was also accused of developing an own cult of personality in his leadership style. So he is removed. Brezhnev replaces him as the head of the Communist Party. Do not think that he was elected by the Soviet people. He was not. He's just head of the party and therefore head of the state. Okay. He does keep some of Khrushchev's policies, like keeping military spending high. And the economy of the Soviet Union does grow somewhat. All right. Living standards of average citizens improves. They become the world's largest petroleum producer, and they also develop their mineral and natural gas resources. Despite that, however, a number of crop failures leads to high food prices, and if you cannot feed your own citizens, it doesn't matter how many minerals that you can pull out of the earth, it will still stagnate your economy. Brezhnev also ends the de-Stalinization campaigns of Khrushchev. This will place new restrictions on literature and art. Of course, writers and intellectuals, other minority groups, like ethnic minorities and religious groups, basically criticize this, increased censorship. Many intellectuals, instead of being, thrown into prison or thrown into mental institutions, are allowed to leave. One of these includes Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, is able to leave the USSR and are basically in exile, though, for criticizing the Soviet government. So what we see here, is a restriction on the freedom of expression in the Soviet Union. But at the same time, Soviet and U.S. relations are actually improving. Brezhnev will die in 1976 from a stroke, and what we'll get after him are a series of pretty weak and ineffective leaders that have rapid turnover, leading to the end of the Soviet system in 1991. Now keep in mind, in 1976, we've only had four leaders ever of the Soviet Union in close to 60 years. That's Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, right? So four leaders is not that many, and it does restrict democracy when you have that few of leaders, but it actually is effective at making your government fairly stable. And we're going to have about that many leaders for the next decade, beginning in the late 70s into the late 80s. And it spells disaster really for the Soviet system. The Soviet system runs on authoritarianism. As soon as you lose the authority and strong hand of their leaders, the system breaks down. By the late 70s and 80s, corruption, favoritism, and alcoholism are all on the rise, and life expectancy and the belief in communism as a viable governmental and economic structure is on the decline. Now, Eastern Europe in the 1960s is going through all sorts of changes as well. Eastern European nations want to decrease Soviet hegemony over them. It's one of my favorite words, by the way. Hegemony just means simply direction or heading of, or a position of power over others. Khrushchev actually had put down a revolt in 1956, but Hungarians are really interested in creating their own brand of communism, as are many other Eastern European nations. We also see in the 60s a Sino-Soviet split, so a split between the Chinese and Soviet relations. But really the only power in the world, not even a power, the only country in the world that leaves Soviet oversight that is communist is Albania, right? And Albania, little itty bitty Albania, actually goes ahead and forges their own path. And the reason why they do it is because no one at this point really considers Albania even worth holding on to, right? So Albania is able to leave Soviet oversight, but other Eastern European nations, larger ones, more prosperous ones, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., are not able to leave Soviet oversight. We do see change in Hungary when their leader, János Kadar, relaxes economic planning and does permit some personal freedoms. Also in Poland, we see farmland remaining in private hands. 1968, however, we see another pushback from the Soviet Union when the Czech leader Alexander Dubček begins a policy of liberalization. So he's trying to reduce censorship, recognize civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, etc., and allowing political parties to emerge. And the Soviets will have none of it. They do not want those trends to spread, and they are invaded by a joint force. Dubček's removed from office, and the Prague Spring, as this new wave of liberalization comes to be called, is halted. We also see with the invasion a new doctrine known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, and this says that simply, I'll read it to you and then explain it, every communist party is responsible not only to its own people, all right, and its own nation, but to all socialist countries. And the sovereignty of individual socialist countries cannot be counterposed on the interests of world socialism. So what this is really defined as is, all communist nations are linked together, and just because you can't just look after your own brand of communism, you are accountable to all of the citizens in all the other countries. So if I am a communist in Poland, right, and there are communists in Estonia, right, which are doing their own thing that is not pure communism, then as Polish communists, I actually have the right to invade that country to kind of snap that back into shape, which is why when Czechoslovakia is invaded, it's not just by the Soviet Union, it's by a bunch of other countries. All right, they are looking out for world communism, not just that particular country's brand. Detente also goes to Germany. 1960s, Willy Brandt creates a new political philosophy known as Ostpolitik, which means simply a hand offered to the East. Both German nations recognize each other, both go into the UN. All right, and basically we have a lessening of tensions in Germany. The Berlin Wall, though, will actually go up during this time period, so don't think that it's complete relaxation. We have a new U.S. president, Richard Nixon, who, even though he's a staunch anti-communist in the beginning, will also help relax Cold War tensions. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, will make these goals a reality. Kissinger is probably the most important American statesman in the 20th century in helping to lessen tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Detente, as I mentioned earlier, really is expressed fully in the ability of both of these nations to limit their nuclear arsenals. Okay, both the Soviet Union and the U.S. Are really spending enormous amounts of their budgets on nuclear weapons buildups, but also on new technology. There's two new weapon systems: anti-ballistic missiles, which are missiles that shoot down other missiles, and then MIRVs, or multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, which is basically a giant car that can shoot a bunch of warheads at different spots, right? Anyway, these are very, very costly. They are draining the economies, and so what we see happen in 1972 is Nixon and Brezhnev will sign the first arms limitation treaty, the SALT I treaty. All right, and this suspends the construction of all ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. Despite this, though, both countries can blow each other up many times over. They have the ability of overkill. And so even though we see the lessening of new construction, we're still going to have multiple tens of thousands of warheads pointed at each other. Also, during this time period in 71, 72, the U.S. and China will break through what we call the bamboo curtain. That's their counterpoint to the Iron Curtain. Both sides had, both China and U.S. have been critical of each other, but as the U.S. and Soviets come together, the Chinese are worried that they will be left out, right? The U.S. rethinks its policy of containment in regards to Chinese expansion. All right, the People's Republic of China, or China, replaces Taiwan on the UN Security Council, on the permanent seat of the Security Council, which is pretty amazing. And Nixon even visits in 1972 to receive a really awesome welcome in China. The Chinese give 2 pandas to the U.S. as a gift, which is a very bold statement of cooperation. What's interesting is actually the U.S. gives 2 musk ox. I'll give you a picture of this. 2 musk oxen, rather, to China. In return for their pandas. So I don't know if that's a fair trade, but that's literally what happened. Anyway, so some traveling. Embassies are open in each other's capitals. Tourism has increased, and though the U.S. continues to back Taiwan, as a viable power, both countries, the People's Republic of China and the U.S., get along much better. 1975, we have a meeting in Helsinki, Finland, where 33 European nations, the U.S. and Canada, finally agree on the borders of Europe after World War II. That comes from this political cartoon here. In Yalta, they had more or less, divided Europe after the war. We see FDR and Stalin, right? But it's not formally agreed upon until 75, 30 years later, and this is Nixon and Brezhnev. Anyway, despite all these easing of tensions I mentioned, many powers continue to test nuclear bombs underground. China tests over the ground, and though the SALT Treaty limits construction of ICBMs, both powers, the USSR and US, improve the speed, range, accuracy, and power of their weapons, right? And so by 1978, we still have a situation where we have 40,000 warheads that have 1.5 million times the explosive power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. We also have new weapons, stealth bombers, and low-flying cruise missiles that cannot be detected by radar, neutron bombs or dirty bombs that can blow people up without actually destroying infrastructure, laser beams or ray guns, and then space satellites that can fire weapons. Right. So some of these things that previously have been part of science fiction are now realities. This, of course, is a picture of a stealth bomber right here. All right, we'll switch gears now and go to Western Europe and talk about them real quick. 1970s in Western Europe, we see basically a sector of the world's economy that has exploded. Great Britain was the only power in Western Europe that had some stagnated economic growth. They were led by the Labour Party, which is the more leftist-leaning party. But in 1974 and 75, we get a recession. Increased food and petroleum prices lead to a kind of a downturn in economies in Western Europe. Of course, this happens in the U.S. as well. Inflation rates in West Germany go to 7% and 25% in Great Britain. And the leaders who come to power during this time period are actually formerly economic ministers. So, in West Germany, Helmut Schmidt comes to power. And the goal for all these new prime ministers and presidents is to make sure that the economies get back on track, and they do. Europe rebounds in the 1970s, although it's very short-lived, and by the 1980s we see a global recession and the highest unemployment rate since World War II. Even though we see economic downturns, though, and in general in Europe, that's usually a signal for radical governments. The governments in Europe remain moderately conservative or moderately socialist. That doesn't mean there's not heavy turnover. Italy changes the government on an average of once a year. So there's still massive turnover in some states. But, radical states, former right-wing states like Portugal and Spain, who have had dictators since before World War II, become socialists, along with France, Greece, and Sweden. And many of these states have remained very left-leaning or full-blown socialists. There are three major leaders during this time period. Helmut Kohl in West Germany, Francois Mitterrand in France, and Margaret Thatcher, and that's a picture right here, the first female prime minister in Britain, are all trying to rebuild their economies in this early 1980s. Kohl and Thatcher are conservatives, but Mitterrand is a socialist. So it's not going to be just one economic philosophy. All the leaders in Europe are all trying to do the same thing from different ends of the political spectrum. Also during the 80s, Europe will increase new waves of terrorist activity. This is not from radical Islamic groups like it is today. It's from anti-capitalist groups or certain extreme left or right-leaning political groups. Okay, but they do carry out bombings, kidnappings, assassinations. Germany and Italy are two areas where we really see this. Pope John Paul II is actually wounded by a Turkish terrorist. Basque rebels in Spain commit violence, and the IRA in Northern Ireland becomes very active during this time period. These are political terrorist groups, though. These are not radical Islamic groups, so make sure to keep that in mind. Eastern Europe and détente, I'm going to skip going over this in detail. Basically, this falls in line with Eastern European nations trying to get their own flavor of communism. And you can read this through. I'll scroll through it quickly. The major nation we want to talk about here, though, is Poland. Their new government, Solidarity, here it is right here, is a labor union that kind of morphs into a political party, and they are looking for the freedom for trade unions, salary increases, reductions in political prisoners, reductions in censorship, and more access to mass media. The Soviets pushed back against this. They put General Wojciech Jaruzelski, who declares a state of emergency, declares martial law, arrests Solidarity leaders, food prices go up, and really, this is a bad idea for the Soviet Union. High debt, high prices leads to bad economic conditions throughout the 1980s, and it's these economic conditions that will really spell the end for the Soviet Union. Okay, and more so, Eastern Europe will turn to the West for help, all right, economic help specifically, and eventually the Soviet Union just lets it happen. Now, the collapse of détente, how does this happen, right? How does this relaxing of tensions go away? Well, it really comes from the election of Ronald Reagan, okay? And I love this map. It's one of my favorite maps. It's not appropriate whatsoever and is fairly racist, but this is the world according to Ronald Reagan, right? And it reflects some of his foreign policy outlooks, right? And it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of look at this. So anyway, you can peruse this or look up on the internet for a bigger one. Reagan, though a very optimistic leader, a very charismatic leader, has some interesting ideas on America's place in the world that are quite bold. And he, does some things that alienate Russia and other powers during his presidency. He doesn't start this. Jimmy Carter actually is the one who starts to push the Soviet Union away. He places more emphasis on human rights, so he's going to criticize the Soviet and Chinese governments for their restriction on human rights. This is the era of Tiananmen Square, right, where basically China marches on their own people that are undergoing a peaceful protest, and Carter condemns this. He supports Soviet dissidents. The Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979, which upsets the peace in the Middle East, right? And Carter condemns that as well. And this leads to the U.S. failing to ratify the second SALT treaty. We boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow and cease shipping grain to the Soviet Union. Now, like I said, Reagan exacerbates this problem. In 1981, he assumes the presidency and promptly labels the Soviet Union an evil empire, right? He increases military spending, and he develops a new program known as the Star Wars program, or Strategic Defense Initiative, which is a space-based defense system. That's true. We developed that and spent enormous amounts of money on this. And the attempt would be to destroy Soviet missiles from space before they could reach the United States. This is heavily criticized by Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, right? And what we get is more tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union. And this is why when you watch Top Gun, right, we're fighting against the Soviets again, right? And then we're shooting down planes and whatnot. U.S. is also upset with Soviet actions in Poland. The Soviets shoot down a Korean civilian jet plane in 1983. And Reagan condemns all of this, right? He says this is absurd. It shows that the Soviet system is barbaric. And, basically this tension escalates, so that the Soviet nations, the communist-backed nations, refuse to participate in the 1984 Summer Olympic Games. Okay, so, Detente, a lot of opportunities for relaxation of tensions for both powers to kind of see the humanity in the other side. But by the mid-1980s, we start to see those tensions increasing. The good news is that the heightened tensions don't last long, and instead of a strong Soviet or communist system reemerging, what we see is the collapse of the Soviet system very, very quickly after the 1980s. Good luck on your questions, and let me know if you need anything. Thank you.